People don't know their emotional connection is off. Either their sex life is just dead or they start looking for novelty. This is when they start looking for more novelty. But eventually, if you're looking for novelty to replace emotional connection, there's never going to be enough novelty. You just have to keep finding newer and newer things. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with novelty, but if it's not paired with emotional connection, it's probably never really going to stick.
Why is it, as humans, we can't say the actual thing that's bothering us to our partner? Why do we have to kind of say, you never listen, instead of what we really want to know is, do I matter to you?
I think a lot of times people just don't know how. They're just not taught how. Parents, even the best of the parents that are well-intentioned, they don't have the language. They don't have the emotional awareness within themselves. We're busy. Most people aren't, we're putting a lot of energy into education and activities and all of these things. And people aren't prioritizing emotional health in the same way.
Why do couples end up having the same argument over and over again? Like in the most succinct way, so they can stop doing it.
People come together and they have, everybody feels seen, understood, cared for. Both partners do. It's early in the relationship. And then all of a sudden, bam, there's some sort of conflict. There's some sort of rupture. And one partner feels hurt, but they don't know how to talk about that hurt vulnerably. So instead, they come in with something like, well, you never listen, or you just don't care. And the other partner, they don't see the pain. They just hear criticism. And then their shame gets touched and they don't know how to talk about that.
So welcome to the show, Julie. How are you?
I'm good. Lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
No, the pleasure is all mine. I wanted to have you on today because I, for the longest time, have wanted to have someone who can give us a real contextual conversation around attachment styles, because it's the buzzword right now. It's trending everywhere. People are using it, maybe like in a deep way because they've read the literature around it, or in a superficial way where they're just kind of using the label. But I really wanted to have someone who, like yourself, has a best-selling book called Secure Love that explains attachment styles and kind of like how to navigate conflict when those aren't necessarily syncing up together. And you're also part of a new wave of psychologists that are really good at packaging things that in academic literature might be quite complicated, but making it digestible for the everyday person, which I think is a super skill. So give yourself a pat on the back for that. I guess where we could start is a little introduction and just the basic functions of what attachment styles are.
Yeah. So I like to think of, we all have this drive to stay connected in our relationships. It's in our bodies. We can't override it. It's like a drive, the same intensity as the drive to eat, because we do need other people to be safe in the world and survive as humans. So we can't turn this need to stay connected with our close others. And when I say close others, the people that we depend the most upon to get through life together and feel emotionally connected and filled up. And so what happens is we all have this normal fear when those relationships get disrupted. We're supposed to feel uncomfortable in our body. The same way our body gets uncomfortable when we need food, our body gets uncomfortable when our relationship, there's a rupture. So people can be categorized by the types of fears that they're most sensitive to in relationships and how they respond to those fears. What do they do when those fears get activated? So, for example, let's say someone grew up in an environment where their parents responded to them really unpredictably emotionally, or were really invalidating, or sent a lot of messages, your emotions are too much, or your emotions are unreasonable. And so this person learned to fear these moments of emotional abandonment, because every time you get a message, your emotions don't matter, or they're too much, or we're not there for you, that is an emotional abandonment. So on top of that, some people actually were physically abandoned, and so now they're going to have even more fears, that physical and emotional abandonment. And so someone who is really sensitive to moments of emotional abandonment most likely has an anxious attachment. They're kind of always worried, when am I going to get abandoned? When am I going to get abandoned? And then on top of that, when that fear gets triggered, they tend to behave in a pretty predictable way. They kind of anxiously try to close the distance or try to somehow reestablish connection with protesting or desperate kind of, getting louder or getting more desperate, trying to be heard. And then we have someone who their environment was very just emotionally flat. Their emotions weren't really talked about. They just learned to kind of shut their emotions down because what's the point? No one's going to be there to comfort them. So they learned to feel safe and worthy in relationships by being successful and performing well. That's where they got their sense of worthiness. So now in adult relationships, they're going to be far more sensitive to feelings of being rejected or getting messages you're failing, or having their sense of self threatened in any way. And these people we consider to have an avoidant attachment, because the way they deal with their emotional pain is they just shove it down and try to not feel it at all. So they just avoid the feelings. And so typically what they'll do with that is they will try to kind of, if their partner comes to them and their partner has an anxious attachment, because this is a very common pairing, is an anxious attachment with an avoidant attachment. If their anxious attachment partner comes to them and says, hey, I have a problem with XYZ, they're going to try to help their anxious partner in the same way they help themselves, which is, well, just don't feel that way. Or you're making something out of nothing. And then we have someone with a disorganized attachment. And this person, there's more chaotic inner feelings. There's not so much predictability in the way that they respond to their relationship fears. They kind of have all the relationship fears. They grew up in homes that weren't just emotionally insensitive, but were actually emotionally threatening, where it was dangerous to talk about emotions. The person who was loving you was also the person who was harming you. And so they have a lot of high mistrust of people in general. They tend to perceive more threat even when threat might not be there, and they respond very unpredictably when they're upset. And then we have someone with a secure attachment. Now, here's the thing. The most secure person in the world is still going to feel bad when their relationship gets ruptured, when they are worried about an abandonment or rejection, or they just feel dropped or invalidated. Everybody's going to feel bad. It's just that what they do is very different. They know how to manage their own emotions. They know how to stay engaged with their own emotions without being dysregulated. And they know how to communicate in a way that's going to increase the odds that they'll be heard and that the situation can be resolved and there can be a repair. Now, that doesn't mean that their partner will be able to respond to that, because sometimes people can have a secure attachment with self, but their partner still isn't able to be in a securely attached relationship with them. So there's two different relationships that we're talking about. One is with self and the other is with partner. But someone with a secure attachment with self, they're far more likely to be in relationships with someone else who's secure, because they just know what to look for. That feels comfortable and safe for them. And they learned growing up, they developed a template of relationships and what a healthy partner looks like, so they know what to strive for.
It's very clear from what you're saying is that more often than not, it's not particularly groundbreaking, but the code is written in childhood. If you kind of trace it back, you can vaguely or sometimes very obviously see things. But secure people, because they obviously have this tendency to be rational, think about things, step back, look at the bigger picture. On the occasion when they do find someone avoidant or anxious, do they have a tendency to be able to cure that person and help them through it and develop into a secure?
Yeah, I don't know that I would say they can cure that person, but they can do their part to contribute to a safe environment that makes it more likely that that person starts to grow. Because the way they're showing up is safe, and when people feel safe, that means their energy isn't going into defending themselves and protecting themselves and fighting and anxiety. And so their energy is freed up for self-reflection and growth.
You're obviously in the field and you're practicing and you've written a book. I'm writing a book at the moment, and anyone who's writing a book, like, my hat goes off to them. It's a
Yes.
really
Oh my
difficult
gosh.
process.
Yes. It's a labor of love. No question.
Well, that said, because you get the kind of 360 of how much attachment styles are now being spoken in the mainstream, I guess my question is, my sentiment is that you hear people commonly saying, oh, I'm an avoidant, oh, I'm a secure, I'm a this and I'm a that. And the way they kind of do it is quite like surface level, you know? It's kind of like star signs, you know, people treat them in that kind of superficial of, oh, I'm this and I'm that. Oh, yeah. But do you often as a professional think what people sometimes like label themselves is necessarily what they are or what they want to be instead?
I think that for the most part, people probably have a pretty good read, especially people who it just comes quick. They read something and they're like, oh my gosh, I resonate with that so strongly. Some people are definitely, you know, more gray. Some people don't fit into any one category perfectly. They might show up more avoidant in one environment and more anxious in another environment. But I think probably about 75% of people are pretty clearly in one category. And are there people who misdiagnose? Sure. But I think for the most part, most people can probably pretty firmly relate to one category over the others. And I always say, look, you know, to use these labels to the degree that they help you know what to work on. And if they're becoming like confusing and you're finding yourself preoccupied with which category you fit into, or it's actually making you feel bad about yourself, or you know, anything negative coming from it, then that's where you want to kind of step away. We only want to use these labels to the degree that they help you have a better life and relationships.
I guess, like you said earlier, there's instances where even a secure person is going to slightly overlap into maybe like security or avoidance, just because we're human, you know. But I guess the difference is that they've got the emotional equipment to pick themselves up and rationally look at it.
Yes.
When you look at those insecure attachments or avoidant attachments, or the other one is disorganized, correct? When that stuff is so richly baked into our past, you know, from trauma or circumstances growing up, you know, how hard is it to unweed that personally? Like, is it something we're on a constant, ever-long journey with? Can we ever shake it off? You know, what's your take on it?
Well, it's, you know, it's complicated because there's, you know, one of the layers is, well, you know, there's a spectrum. Some of us are more secure than others, and some of us are more insecure than others. So the more you lean toward insecurity, the more intense your feelings are, the less ability you have to regulate those feelings with health. The harder, you know, the more growth you have to do, right? You're starting from a different place. And then what kind of help are you getting, right? So that's a big factor too. Are you able to access the kind of help that can get you through it in the, you know, quickest way possible? Unfortunately, there are different qualities of help out there, levels of quality. And then another thing is, what kind of a relationship are you in? Because people who are in more distressed relationships, obviously they have more stress and more pain to deal with. So it's going to make it harder. And then what kind of stress level do you have in life in general? So there's lots of different layers, but regardless, everybody can heal. It's just a matter of really, at the end of the day, it's simple, but not simple. The simplicity of it is, in moments when you have some sort of trigger around a relationship, or really any trigger, because almost every single trigger out there, regardless of what it's about, is going to circle back to some sort of relationship trigger, relationship with self or relationship with others. When you have this nervous system reaction in your body, which is some sort of fear, which is attached to some unresolved grief and some shame, how do you step back and manage that? Right there, just right there in that moment. What are you doing with that feeling? Because we have a couple of different options when we get a bad feeling. One is we can choose to, or learn how to help that feeling and give it some help in the way it needs, and kind of step back and go, okay, feeling is there. What am I going to do here? Let me listen. Let me sit with it. It's not about ignoring it. It's not about just going into your head. It's about saying, okay, what's going on with me? What's the fear right now? And then what can I do with this that's healthy? And the other option is to get reactive and let that feeling just kind of get so big in you that you just, react to it in some way that, you yell or you stuff it down or something that really doesn't serve you in the long term. So that's really the simplicity of it. But for some people, it's harder to learn to do that than others.
You just reminded me of some really good advice, like some of the best life advice I ever got. Basically, when you're confronted with something that's going to trigger a response, because we're all human, right? Something's going to happen and we're not going to like it and we're going to react to it. And then we'll be left to kind of clean up the mess and deal with it. But someone said to me, if you can't, just for 5 or 10 minutes, sit still and just think about things, process it, let it kind of come through you and out of you, that's like something you need to work on. And when you said that, I kind of married what she said to that, and it just, I don't know, that's what that reminded me of. That stillness and just letting it flow through, and giving yourself time to organize things emotionally.
I think you just said it. That's the work. Like you said, I think feel it and then organize it and make sense of it. And then we have to figure out, okay, well, this bad feeling's here, right? So now what does it need to be helped? Do I need to talk about it with someone? Do I need to just kind of do some grief work here? Do I need to get clear about my fears? Do I need to give myself some reassurance around shame? Do I need to reach for help? Do I need to set some boundaries?
Well, that is great advice, and I am with you, but I also know myself, and from just looking at the world, there is one half of the population who's not socialized with that tool belt as well as the other half, and that's men. Because I just don't feel like it's taught to them as young boys. It's not taught in their outlook on what a man would be So if I said this probably 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, they would say, oh my God, no, that what are you talking about? Stop with this voodoo, whatever, spiritual. It's just basic emotional regulation. Where I record this podcast is in a therapist co-op. So we have an annual meetup and we all meet up in the same room. And I'm the elephant in the room because I'm not a therapist. But the one piece of advice that they all said consistently when I asked them is what's the number one thing that you look for in a relationship? And it's the ability to have emotional regulation. And yeah, I don't think it's baked into boys as well as it is into girls. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I do think there's truth to that. I'm definitely my next book. I'm writing my second book right now, and then my third will be for men. Thank you. Yeah. It's a lot, like you said. Yeah, and the third is definitely going to be for men, to help men kind of learn how to become more emotionally available and trust vulnerability, be open to it, and also learn how to see the value in it. But I will say this, I work with a lot of couples, and I do see that women are more emotional, but they're not always vulnerable. They don't always know how to be vulnerable. And that is something that there's a difference between the two. So emotional is when you feel the emotions and you can, cry and say, I'm sad, and say,
express them.
Yeah, express them. Exactly. But there's a difference between that and being vulnerable. Vulnerable is more of a regulated state where you're feeling the feeling, but you're not just overwhelmed with it and you're not just spewing. You're actually saying, okay, what's happening right now is I'm getting this message that you're not with me, and I'm feeling really alone. And that takes me to a very sad place, and I need some help there.
I really I understand the word vulnerable and what it means, but even I really don't like it, because I feel like when I am vulnerable, I'm literally opening myself up to like being hurt, you know.
Sure. Yeah.
And that, I suppose that's me being like vulnerable right now, you know.
Yes, absolutely. And I
What
mean,
would you say to someone who is kind of avoidant of opening their vulnerability because they feel like that's just opening the floodgates to being hurt?
I would say it makes absolute sense. You know, it's easier, it's less painful to be rejected when we're mad than it is to be rejected when we really open up and show our true self. So when we really get vulnerable, we're like naked, you know, we're showing it all. And we are setting ourselves up for rejection. But at the same time, we're also setting ourselves up for the deepest level of connection. And, you know, vulnerability isn't a one-sided street. It's got to have someone else on the other side who's able to hold that vulnerability for it to work, or who's at least able to learn, you know, willing to learn how to hold that vulnerability.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like that's like just a knowledge nugget within itself. In the book, you suggest a lot of relationship fights are about attachment security. You know, there's kind of common arguments of, you never listen to me, but the translation internally is, do I matter to you? Or you just shut down in arguments. The translation is, am I safe emotionally with you internally? Can you exactly explain what brought you to that kind of conclusion and observation just through your work, and what you've been seeing and the poignance of it?
Yeah, you know, really that information isn't my information. That is the information of the modality I use, which is called emotionally focused therapy for couples, which has been Sue Johnson was a researcher and clinician, and she created this modality back starting in the late 80s using attachment theory to treat couples. And what she found is that when couples would get into a fight, it was always a predictable pattern, and it was always kind of rooted in the fact that they were communicating unmet attachment needs. You know, the topic could be dressed, the cycle can be dressed up in different topics, but at the end of the day, it's just partners are saying to each other, or they're hearing, let me say it that way, they're not necessarily saying to each other, but they're hearing, you don't care about me, you don't appreciate me, you don't see me, my feelings aren't valid to you. And so they get locked into these cycles, and then one partner gets louder and more anxious trying to connect and be heard, and the other one gets more defensive or withdrawn, trying to just keep the peace or protect themselves. And so I learned to see couples fights through this lens, through this attachment lens. And so what I do to cure that is I help them, regardless of what they're talking about, learn how to communicate with each other in ways that are actually meeting their attachment needs instead of unmeeting them. And that's really the game changer. And then they have to learn to use vulnerability to do that. And what I've seen over and over is that when couples learn to get good with vulnerability and use that for conflict instead of these fighting protective places, the relationship symptoms start to really decrease on their own, and they start finding, oh my gosh, we can work through our problems now so much more easily.
Why is it as humans we can't say the actual thing that's bothering us to our partner? You know, why do we have to kind of say, you never listen, instead of what we really want to know is, do I matter to you? Is that the vulnerability that we're scared of?
I think, yeah, it could be, but I think a lot of times people just don't know how. You know, they're just not taught how growing up. They, you know, parents, even the best of the parents that are well-intentioned, you know, they don't have the language, they don't have the emotional awareness within themselves. We're busy, you know, most people aren't, you know, we're putting a lot of energy into education and activities, and all of these things, and people aren't prioritizing emotional health in the same way. And it takes time and it takes space. And
Yeah, for sure, it takes time and space. And I think sometimes people forget that, you know, each generation, each cycle of parenting gets more emotionally developed and better because it's evolution. You know, we learn from the past. We see I'm saying that in the current state of the world, we see what's happening in the past. We think, well, this can be better, and we improve it for our children. You know, it's just as natural as evolution can be. But I think sometimes people forget that, you know, parenting sometimes is embedded from different generations. Like, I'm 27, so my parents grew up with my grandparents who were in the war. And that's one generation that was experiencing something that was quite, you know, dramatic and horrible. And then they raised my, you know, parents' generation, and that generation raised me. And you sometimes don't really pay attention to, you know, the systems and the ideas that kind of get lost but brought with you from generation to generation to generation. You know, I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on like how sometimes we can just keep an eye on like not always not being in the know of that.
yeah, I mean, I think, you know, generational trauma is a real thing. You know, like you said, let's say your grandfather was in a war and had a lot of traumatic experiences and had to learn to turn off his emotions because the stuff he was going through was just too emotionally overwhelming. So he had to learn to just shut it down, turn it off. And then he goes back home, and now he has to raise this family and be in a relationship with his wife, but he doesn't know how to turn his emotions back on. And so now his relationships suffer because he isn't able to be fully emotionally available, and he maybe has temper outbursts because his feelings aren't coming out in a healthy way, and he's not able to talk to his kids about feelings or show affection or whatever. Then those kids are now going to have emotional limitations because they didn't get what they needed. They didn't get the modeling. Nobody was there to kind of help them meet their needs for connection and also help them talk about their feelings. And, you know, they miss out on that. And then, you know, sadly, if they don't learn how to do it as adults because they either don't have the right resources or nobody, you know, a lot of times, and, you know, it isn't until the past 20 or so years that therapy has become so much more mainstream, then they're probably going to pass those traits on to their kids, and nobody really, you know, we can't fix what we don't know is happening. So I think people are starting to be much more aware now, but there's a lot of damage that's been done that we're trying to clean up. And you can see it with this mental health crisis.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's also like a really beautiful lesson in, you know, where you can just like give people grace for what they received in their generation. Like,
Absolutely.
as you said, you know, like expecting your grandma who wasn't given the same emotional tool belt as you to understand something as quickly as you can now in the present day. Like, it's going to take them a little bit of time to understand and validate their own feelings. But then again, I think you see it reflected into like a lot of older people nowadays. Like, they've got to their pensioner ages. I'm not sure if it's the same word in America, pensioners, like OAPs. And they're just living life. Like, they've finally learned that, oh, I don't have to do things like this exact way. So I'm going to take that holiday. I'm going to divorce my life partner, or I'm going to enter this like gay relationship that I never felt like I could. Which is like really beautiful to see. But you are right. We have got like a long way to go. But just go back to the, you know, arguments and, you know, how that feeds into attachment styles. I'm interested when a secure person versus insecure person is arguing, because a secure person, like in my mind, what they would effectively do if, you know, nothing is getting solved and the cycle keeps on continuing, is that they would like cut their losses and walk away because it's just not helpful. It's run its course. We can't keep on doing the same thing because the definition of insanity is doing it over and over again. But insecure, like almost in a sense, does that person just keep on going back for more because they're too scared to exit? Is that like a fair interpretation?
Sometimes, I think even the most secure person might not actually leave the relationship. Sometimes people stay for different reasons, family reasons, money reasons, whatever. I think the difference between secure and insecure is a secure person stops expecting. They stop expecting that their partner is going to be able to show up for them in the way that they need to feel safe and close. And they grieve that. They accept it, and they grieve the loss of what they hoped it would be. And then they come out on the other side, and they still feel strong within, and they find other ways to feel filled up in life and accept the relationship the way it is, whether, again, that's leaving it or physically staying. Someone with an insecure attachment, I mean, they get divorced all the time. Sometimes people will just stay indefinitely, and like you said, stop. Keep having hope. What?
Like literally divorced?
Yes, I think people with
Yeah.
insecure attachment, yeah, they divorce a lot. But some don't. Some stay in the relationship and think, well, if I just keep trying hard enough, it'll get better. And sometimes it does eventually, and sometimes it doesn't. But I think the difference really isn't about staying or leaving. I think the difference is adjusting your expectations to the reality of the situation.
That's so interesting. I never would have like heard it in the way you said it, but
Are
you
you? I just was actually a couple days ago on Oprah. Oprah did a podcast on quiet quitting, and so that's funny because we were just talking about this exact topic.
no, it's coincidence. I think we don't have it in the UK, but it's
Yeah.
interesting that secure, attachment and love is directly reflected and correlated in your ability to process and grieve and move on. Like I can imagine as well on the flip side, people who are particularly insecure, unfortunately we live in a world where people will want to exploit that very vulnerability, because a secure person will walk away from a relationship and know their worth and just say, oh, okay, right, fine, I feel negative, I'm going to move on. But I guess like there is a lot of vulnerability and a lot of, harm that could come of someone who's insecure, because like someone who maybe has narcissistic tendencies or, something within the dark tetrad, which another psychologist I'm a big fan of, Dr. Nadine Macluso, she kind of gave me some information on that. But basically, insecure attachment does not shield you from any of those negative things happening, and that's scary.
You mean secure attachment doesn't shield you?
Sorry, like, basically,
Yeah, it does to a degree, because people with a secure attachment have different expectations from relationships. So they're going to be more aware. They're going to notice really quickly if someone isn't emotionally available, meaning they just aren't emotionally available, or they're actually all the way to sociopath or narcissist, because it's kind of like, if you grew up with healthy food, you know what healthy food is. If you grew up with healthy relationships, you know how you feel. You know what you want to feel like in interactions with a person. So there is a, something to be said for that. But with that said, there are people who are, get trapped. They get fooled. They get stuck in a relationship where someone presents themselves as something they're not. And maybe they grew up in a relatively healthy environment, but there were still some holes there, and they don't, they just missed some signs. And I mean, that's really hard. It's really, really hard.
People will there'll always be opportunistic people in the world who will want to take advantage. But on a more positive note, what's the best advice you could give someone with an insecure attachment style to communicate their genuine needs, especially if they've had the trouble of being called needy or too much in the past?
Well, I think, first of all, they need to make sure that they're owning those needs within themselves. That there's not a part of themselves that's saying, well, maybe it's true. Maybe I am wanting too much, right? Because a lot of times people do that to themselves. One part of them knows, okay, I need more attention. I need more time. I need more emotional validation. But then this other part comes in and says, well, maybe you're asking for too much. So I always I always need to get that person kind of grounded in what their needs actually are. And we start by an unmet need in a moment. Like, okay, what happened when, your partner said you're being unreasonable? Well, I felt invalidated. Okay, well, where did that take you? Well, that took me to sad and alone. All right. And so let's put some words to that. And the way that would sound to the partner is, in that moment, I felt really sad and alone. And what my sadness needs is it need to feel comforted, is it needs to know that you can validate my emotions. Even if you might not agree with all the details of the situation, that at least you're willing to come in and say, I see that you were sad. I see that was really hurtful for you.
I guess this also leads nicely on to another theme that is covered in the book, a major concept that, especially negative cycles are something that are so common that we just kind of almost to a point put up with, like falling into rejected patterns or ones where one partner pursues and the other one withdraws. And it's this constant, mismatch of, things that don't match up together. If this is a constant cycle and a constant thread that goes through a lot of couples, why do couples end up having the same argument over and over again? Like in the most succinct way so they can stop doing it.
Yeah, well, people come together and they have, everybody feels seen, understood, cared for. Both partners do. It's early in the relationship. And then all of a sudden, bam, there's some sort of conflict. There's some sort of rupture. And one partner feels hurt, but they don't know how to talk about that hurt vulnerably. So instead, they come in with something like, well, you never listen, or you just don't care. Then the other partner, they don't see the pain. They just hear criticism. And then their shame gets touched. And they don't know how to talk about that. So then they say, well, you're just seeing it all wrong, or you should just let it go. And then the first partner, now they feel invalidated and they get more upset and they push harder. And then the second partner either deflects harder or defends harder or shuts down. And then the next thing you know, they're both, the topic that they got into the original conflict over doesn't get resolved because they can't talk about it safely, and they've harmed themselves emotionally. So they've built up some mistrust and emotional, they both got hurt, right? And so then they don't know how to repair it because they don't have the skills. So they push it under the rug. But then eventually the topic comes up again. They still don't know how to talk about it safely. And they have the wounds from the last one lingering around. And so they just keep going into these same habitual patterns because they simply don't know what else to do. So the only way out of them is to learn to talk about all these things with vulnerability. That's the only way out. We have two options when there's big feelings and in conflict and pain. We can either do the pain in negative cycles with all these protections, or we can do the pain vulnerably and in a way that inspires empathy and really being able to respond to each other and join each other instead of pushing each other away.
But if two people are literally caught in that cycle, and let's just say one's avoidant, one's insecure, for argument's sake, when are they ever going to come to the realization that maybe it's time that one of us acknowledge, to have a bit of vulnerability or to go to therapy? Because by the sounds of it, it sounds like people can do this for a really long time.
Well, I think it's just like anything else. When you're struggling with something, at some point you have to say, well, look, we either need to get some help and try to get out of this, or we need to, we're going to just keep getting stuck doing the same thing over and over. And, that's why I wrote the book, is really to help couples see these cycles, understand them, see that they're happening, that these fights aren't just random, and actually partners really 99% of the time aren't trying to hurt each other. The negative cycle is the enemy, not each other. And then how can we learn to start preventing them and interrupting them and healing from them? But I think that, both partners do need to be able to recognize, hey, this isn't working. Let's get some help here.
What are some of the most common, repetitive arguments because of this exact reason you hear in your work.
You mean, what are some of the topics? Or
Yeah, because then
okay.
like the listener might hear it and then think, aha, like I know this.
Yeah, so negative cycles can happen over any topic. Couples are each relationship has different sensitivities, areas where they don't see eye to eye. So it could be over money, it could be over parenting, it could be over sex, it could be over our relationship and our connection, it could be over in-laws, it could be over jobs, it could be over the simplest thing, what seems like the simplest thing, like where are we going to go to dinner? But if we're communicating about where we're going to go to dinner in a way that is communicating, well, you don't matter to me, or you're not listening, or I feel small, or I feel unheard, or I feel invalidated, then it doesn't really matter if the details are small or if the surface issue is small. What matters is what's happening emotionally under the surface.
I sometimes think, if people approached the arguments with the mindset of, okay, we're arguing about this, we've argued about it a couple of times, let's solve it, let's both come to the table and handle this maturely, like how much time you would have to enjoy the relationship and focus on the important stuff, spending quality time, and like I hope I'm in a secure attachment, but like my mindset is like, let's solve this so it doesn't become an issue, so we can go and focus on the good stuff. But, it's easy to say now, as I'm saying on the podcast, but it's difficult to practice it in real life. Like, I do appreciate that. It takes time.
Yeah, I think that some people say, well, that sounds like a lot of work to, go to therapy or read books or understand these cycles and learn these skills and practice. And I always say, look, it takes exponentially more work in the long run to fight all the time. So, it's just like anything else. If you decide, hey, I want to get in shape, you want to feel better when you're walking up the stairs or whatever. I mean, you do have to put the work in to go take care of yourself. But in the long run, your life is better because of it.
But I do think it's important to dispel this myth or this like magical, like fairy tale, like depiction of love you're given as a child, that, you meet someone and it's happy ever after. No, it's constant work. It's like, maybe it's by a therapist, maybe it's by you two having like dedicated time to each other that is just a non-negotiable or whatever. But like, people do forget it is work. And like, therapy like sometimes gets a bad rep. It's getting the reputation it needs now of being something healthy, but people think it's a place you go where something is wrong, but in reality it should be a place where we go to just strengthen and maintain, because it's like going to the gym. Like, that's a really good analogy of like working on your health and your fitness. I don't go to the gym. Well, the best way to approach the gym is not when I've like got myself into a dire state of health and I need to like switch it around. I should be going to the gym regularly to do preventative measures so I feel my best. But to me, it sounds so normal and so logical and so like obvious to me. But I just, I struggle that like a lot of people don't get that.
Yeah, I mean, I think people, would be nice if things were easy. I think it's easy much easier when people know, what to do and they've practiced it enough that it starts to become intuitive. So I like to say, well, yeah, first it's work. I mean, it's hard. It requires sacrifice. Your body and brain aren't used to it. And it's always hard to do new things. But at some point it becomes less about working and more about nurturing.
Yeah.
And, I think that in generations past, I don't know how many years ago, but I think people probably were just emotionally healthier in general. There was less speed, there was less stress, there was less materialism, there was less, I think that it didn't require, everybody didn't need to be going to therapy. But now it's different. Now we've lost emotional health. Life is more complicated. And I think people do need to go and not stay in therapy forever. I don't think that's healthy at all. I always say, look, my job is to work myself out of a job as quickly as possible. But there's so much value in going and learning new ways to navigate hard situations. And the end goal is that it becomes a nurturing instead of a hard work all the time.
You know, a common theme I'm getting from you today, like in terms of like the best advice is, you know, like stripping things back, making them more raw often is the healthier thing. You made a really good point of, you know, now a lot more people need therapy because there's a lot more parts, components and pieces to life. So it's a lot more to, you know, hold all in your brain at the same time. But when life is just more simple and, you know, foundationally, right, this is the job I do, this is home, you know, this and that, it's a lot easier to manage, you know. And I suppose that needs some grace as well.
I think so. I think stress blocks connection.
And even like how stress shows up, because you just think it's, oh, I feel stressed, but it shows up in inflammation. It shows up in like, you know, your weight, your sex life. Is that a fair one to say?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, stress, I think, can wreak havoc on sex.
Yeah.
I mean, it's nothing's ever so black or white. It can also be a good way to de-stress, but you know, some areas of life for some people will be more or less affected by stress. But sex, yes, absolutely. I think the potential is high.
I often think, well, do you know about like the orgasm gap, basically?
No, I don't know that term. Yeah.
Basically, more men reach their orgasm than women do typically. But
sure.
I guess like I don't really have to, you know, bring up that information for people to know it. Just
sure.
Back of their heads. And I think one part of it is education, like as well, sex is taught as a thing that, you know, people learn off porn and they don't necessarily engage. But I think another half of like the reason, apart from like men maybe not typically caring on like how to pleasure a woman in the bedroom, is maybe like the stress women feel, and they're so stressed that they can't even orgasm or they can't even get into the mindset where they can enjoy the sex, because like women are kind of taught to like load on all of this stress, like almost as if it's your responsibility or it's your load. So then they can't go and enjoy the thing that de-stresses them because they're too full to the brim with stress. Like I do wonder if, you know, when you look at like the amount of women in this orgasm gap who aren't orgasming, it is because of the stress, and that's how the stress shows up in that instance.
I would agree with that. I think high amounts of stress can't be helpful because it does. I mean, like you're saying, it requires the ability to let go. And if you can't let go because you have all these things on your mind, or you're feeling disconnected from your partner, or you're trying to think about, you know, taking care of X, Y, and Z, you know, your body isn't going to respond to that.
And people think if I can't see it, then it must not be a problem, right? You know, stress as well. Like if I can't see physical stress on my body, it's not real, you know?
Yeah. That's why I like to get people really in touch with their bodies and try to attach on a physical level, connect on a physical level to the physical sensation of stress. Because you're right. If we can't do that, it's hard to be able to identify these kind of, you know, vague words. Yeah. But it all shows up in the body.
For example, I get palpitations. So like right before I go to bed and I start thinking about everything in the world that's wrong and needs doing, like I literally feel like my heart and my chest doing that. But for someone else, it might be different. Like, you know, there's no way of judging it. But I want to stay on the thread of sexual connection because it's so closely linked to attachment security. When couples feel emotionally disconnected, you know, you kind of state that desire, sexual desire often drops. When you look at like a sexual relationship or like a sexual connection, you know, and there's a really healthy, secure couple, you know, who are having a connection and it's going great, and then you kind of have the mismatch of an avoidant and an insecure, or two insecures. Like, how different do those show up and look?
Well, I think what happens is that, you know, people need to fully let go and to fully connect during sex. I think we need to feel safe with each other and connected outside of sex. And that's where emotional connection is everything. It's so important. So if two people come together and they're carrying, from their, regular outside of sex life together, they've had all these cycles and they've had all these negative feelings that aren't getting talked about built up between them. So then all of that's there during sex. So if they're carrying resentment or feelings of shame or unsafety or messages, I've been failing you, or messages you don't really care about my needs, that will interfere with bonding and the ability to relax with each other and the ability to experience the emotional connection during sex. If you're not experiencing outside of sex emotional connection, it's going to be very difficult to experience it inside of sex. That doesn't mean no couple can. Like I said, it's not always black or white. But I think what happens is when people don't know their emotional connection is off, either their sex life is just dead or they start looking for novelty. This is when they start looking for more novelty. But eventually, if you're looking for novelty to replace emotional connection, there's never going to be enough novelty. You just have to keep finding newer and newer things. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with novelty, but if it's not paired with emotional connection, it's probably never really going to stick.
That is so true, Julie. Like, I've never heard anything truer than that. Yeah. Because, like, in a perfect world, again, like, we're not trying to generalize, you should be having some of that, like, kind of real intimate, like, connective tissue sex where it's basically you're really just connecting with each other and doing the function of what a relationship is. And then you should have a bit of spice and a bit of novelty and kind of, get a bit experimental, shall we say.
Sure. Yeah.
But I don't know if it's because I live in London and, there's different types of flavors on every street you kind of walk into. But there's such a propensity to try all these like novel things sexually, or, add these different labels or variations. Like there's an app called Field where basically, you can look for a threesome, or if you're in a relationship, or you can look for different kinks and fetishes, shall we say.
Sure.
But when the relationship becomes, novelty and all these different bells and whistles sexually, you are right. It's often like a mask to kind of just like ignore that we're not actually connecting on that fundamental level. Like, that's so true.
I think so. I think, it's like eroticism is the way I would describe all of that stuff is great, but it can't substitute for emotional connection.
It's kind of like in a diet, you've got your greens, which, you need to be eating every day. You've got your protein, your carbs, and then you got a bit of candy, which, like you need a bit of candy in
Absolutely.
life. Like, have all the candy you want, but just have it in proportion to the other stuff that will make you feel healthy.
Absolutely. I think that's a great analogy.
Thank you.
Yes, that's it, right?
Yeah. I mean, genius always strikes when I don't know it's going to strike. But just to kind of like wrap things up, I guess the point everyone wants to get to is where they're feeling secure in their attachment style. Like that's the end goal for everyone. It's not going to be perfect. As you said, we're not always going to, be 100% secure all the time. I know that, especially myself, I would just wish there was a world where I could be secure all the time, but it's just not realistic. I'm a human. Is secure attachment, how do I phrase this? What's the best way for someone who isn't in an insecure attachment to start doing the things that would shift them to doing that? So if you could speak to someone who is literally in the depths of feeling insecure or avoidant, what are the key things you would say to them as a therapist just to pull them out and start pushing them towards the secure attachment?
Yeah, I would say that, the most important thing is to learn how to do vulnerability when you're talking about hard things. It's easy to do vulnerability when we're not triggered, right? For some people need to learn to do vulnerability at all. But what happens is when someone, gets triggered and, like I said, they feel invalidated by their partner, and their urge, if they have an insecure attachment, especially in this case, an anxious attachment, their urge is to do what they've learned to do when they feel triggered, which is to protest, right? To bring they're not being bad. They're just trying to bring attention to their problem. They're trying to be heard. And they say something like, well, you just never listen, or you just don't really care about me, right? That's probably not going to work, because we're missing a lot of information there. We're not really talking about the deeper feelings that are going on. And instead, we're sending messages to our partner of accusation, and then they feel understood and they feel criticized, and then then they get triggered. And so that person needs to learn how to kind of step back and go, okay, what just happened? All right. So, what I heard them, when I feel invalidated, when I get a message from them that, I'm being irrational, that hurts my heart. I get scared that this is never going to end, and I feel sad and I feel alone. And I've felt this before growing up, and it's a painful place for me. And they're able to say, in this moment, I felt really alone. And it's a hard place for me. And what I'm needing to know that you're willing to kind of see my emotions here and hold me here and help me here, instead of just, instantly going into telling me I'm irrational. And I understand there's something going on for you too, but that's what I'm really needing more of in this relationship, because otherwise I'm just going to keep kind of going into these protesty place, and I don't want to do that. So can you help me with that? And that's going to start up a new conversation. And then the other person, they have the same work to do, which is, when I feel so criticized, that makes me feel ashamed and all these terrible, painful things. And I feel bad there. And then that's when I just want to kind of shut down. I'm not trying to shut you out. I'm really just trying to shut out how painful it feels to think that I'm failing you. And can you help me with that? And so when partners can learn to do this, and it requires that they can tap into themselves and really get more clear about what's going on. And it's work. It takes being able to access information that can help you learn how to do that, and the willingness to do it when you get triggered. And then couples need to learn how to work with each other to help each other in those places. So it's help myself, let's help each other. Help myself, let's help each other.
I guess the bottom line there is to really listen to yourself, like validate what you're going through, then process, move on, and see if you can help the person next to you.
Yes,
that's
absolutely.
Like the bottom line I got. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And reach for help. We need to be able to give and receive. And I think a lot of times what gets couples stuck is that they start asking for help at the same time. And one partner is going, I'm hurting, help me. And the other one's going, well, I'm hurting, help me. And then they get, too much is going on. So sometimes partners, when they're new to this, they just need to put some structure around it. Like, okay, we're going to do this one at a time, right? We're going to deal first. Let me hear about your feelings. You have the space. I'm going to hear you. I'm going to lean in. And then later we'll do my stuff.
Is there anything I can do as a friend if I know that my friend is going through a particularly difficult time and they're a probable avoidant or insecure or disorganized? Is there just some easy words of wisdom that I can just do to help them out as an outsider?
Yeah, I think one approach is to create space to hear them and just say, hey, what's going on? That must be really hard. Tell me about what's happening. Maybe try to seed some attachment language in there, which is, do you get most upset? What is it when you feel invalidated, or do you ever feel like you're failing? Just try to kind of get them open up about and more clear about what need is going unmet. And then, the advice part of it is, hey, have you ever thought about attachment theory? Or have you ever thought that maybe you guys are getting stuck in these negative cycle loops where, nothing really gets resolved and you're pushing and they're pulling, or you're pulling and they're pushing? Because I think there might be some value in exploring that. And and then directing them to some information that is specific to that. Yeah.
And say, hey, here's the link to Julie's book. Maybe you want to read it.
That would, yeah, I think it could.
Thank you so much, Julie, today. Like, I feel there's so many, I like to use the word knowledge nuggets in there. And I hope, like, the listener, whoever is listening to this, you feel validated by, like, you know, the things Julie has shared today. And you, even if you're just feeling something is slightly off in your relationship, or, you know, you want to get better, that this piece of content has helped you. Because, like, what we try to do here is create conversations people are interested in and that are helpful, because that's what the point of all of this is. But finally, do you want to shout out your socials or where people can reach you?
Sure. Yeah. My Instagram is at The Secure Relationship. So you can find me there. And then my book is Secure Love. You can find it anywhere books are sold, Amazon, bookstores. And
are you in Waterstones?
Yes, I am. I was in London a couple of years ago and saw it there. I've been seeing it in airports all over the place. Yeah, it's really cool. It's really surreal. You'll see when you write a book. It's really surreal to see it, you know, out in the wild.
I'm so like, honestly, it's like, it's painful torture is the only way I can describe it.
Horrible.
You love inflicting it on yourself.
Yeah, it's absolutely horrible.
It's like sadomasochistic, but you like it.
I honestly, I don't even know if I could say I liked it. I liked getting it out. I liked being done with it, and I liked that I did it. But I thought it was just absolutely miserable. It's like doing calculus all day, you know. That's how it felt to me, like just sitting there doing calculus all day long. But
it sometimes feels like you've got this thing inside of you, and I always say when I don't feel like doing it anymore, I say, fine, don't do it. Just don't do it. But then I'm like, no, I have to do it because it's inside of me and it has to be put out into the world.
That's actually a good strategy. I'm going to use that.
For the gym, it's amazing.
Yeah, that is. I'm going to do that. Okay, don't do it. Yeah.
Oh, okay. We'll have to get you for part 2 when the next book comes out.
Definitely. Yep.
Thank you so much, Julie.
You're so welcome. It was wonderful. Great conversation.